Well, welcome back. Today's series is all about the qualitative method that's perhaps most synonymous with qualitative research, the focus group. And if you've somehow found these videos through YouTube, my name is Sean Jordan. I'm a professional marketing researcher, and this is the first part of our 5th lecture series for class on qualitative research for marketing researchers. In our previous lecture series, we talked about how qualitative research is like a light in the darkness, helping to define and make sense of the shapes and shadows we see off in the distance. We also talked about how there are 4 basic applications of qualitative research: exploration, deep dives, idea generation, and testing. At this point, we've covered 3 other qualitative methods: observational research, individual in-depth interviewing, and ethnography. And you can check out the other video series to learn more about those. In this series, though, we're going to talk about a technique that's used fairly widely in qualitative research and which generates quick bursts of data from groups of individuals. But I want you to know right off the bat, this method, focus groups, is one that's also incredibly flawed, and you need to be extremely careful as a qualitative researcher in administrating focus groups because the convenience and popularity of focus groups is overshadowed by the massive limitations that the method brings with it. But before we get started, I want to tell you a story about the first focus group I ever attended as a professional researcher and some of the lessons that I learned from it. It was a warm summer night as I walked into the pediatric hospital, but the sweat collecting on my forehead was as much due to the nervousness that I was feeling as it was from the muggy heat. Tonight, I was going to be part of something I'd wanted to experience but which I'd never had the chance to experience live. I was going to assist in administering a focus group, and the president of the firm where I was interning had graciously allowed me to come along for the ride and observe this study. "We don't normally hold these focus groups at the hospital," he warned me once I arrived. He was busy setting up the group in an executive boardroom, and a videographer was working around us, running cable and setting up cameras and microphones around the table so that the observers would be able to view a remote video stream in the next room. "And, I don't usually like doing focus groups in boardrooms," he continued, "because the chairs are too big and the participants usually feel uncomfortable. But tonight's groups are really different from what you're going to see anywhere else because we're going to be talking to families who had their children in the NICU." "What's a NICU?" I asked. "Oh, it's the Natal Intensive Care Unit," he explained. "It's where babies wind up if they're born premature and have difficulties. They can spend weeks or months in the NICU before they're released, and it's a very emotional experience for the parents. They often wind up living in the hospital and putting their lives on hold while they wait for their baby to get better." And I'm going to be completely honest with you. I have no idea what sort of people are going to be in this group tonight. We could have parents whose child actually died in the NICU. And that's one of the reasons the client wanted to hold this group at the hospital, because they thought it might be easier for them to come here and talk about this experience than it would be to do this in a focus group facility. "I, on the other hand," he continued, "think it's a terrible idea to include families who have been through that, and I really hope they don't show up tonight. So I need you to do me a favor tonight if they do show up. We may need to excuse some of these families if they're having too much trouble participating in the focus group. So I'm going to give you these envelopes. Each one of these is filled with their cash incentive for being here tonight. And I want you to watch me very carefully over the video feed because you're going to be observing in the next room. If I give you the signal, I want you to come into the room, tell them that they're needed outside, and then bring their things with them. And then I want you to hand them one of these envelopes, thank them for being here, and show them out without any disruptions. Because I don't want to put them through that, and they won't be able to get past the emotion of losing a child long enough to participate in a focus group." I was actually stunned by what he was telling me. "This is really weird. Why would he even have these people show up in a focus group?" I asked. "It seems like we shouldn't have recruited anyone who had a baby who died here. Didn't we use a screener?" "We did," he nodded. "But I've been doing focus groups for a long time, and you'd be surprised how people will get through the screener and show up for the focus group because they really want that cash incentive, even though they're completely inappropriate for the group. Our recruiter tries really hard to filter them out, and she's really good at what she does, but in this case, it was an oversight on our part, something the client mentioned to me offhand earlier today that we'd never talked about before. We never would have imagined that they'd give us a list where the people we were recruiting might have had a child who died here. And so now we have to be careful about it because that sort of emotion spilling out could completely wreck the group and cause us to have to do it all over again. I must have looked even more nervous as I thought about the prospect of escorting out a focus group participant who was in the midst of an emotional breakdown, because then our company president said, "All right, Sean, look, don't worry. It probably isn't going to come down to this. If I sense something's wrong, I can shut the person down from speaking too much, and then I can call a break, and then I can excuse them out before we start back up. But I still need you to be ready. They may need help out, they may be upset, and if that happens, just do your best to help them get out of here so that we don't have to put them through this. You have no idea how talking about a child who died is going to affect them. They may be a complete wreck. They may not be able to walk. I hope it won't come down to that, but if it gets ugly, just be ready so we can try to save the rest of this group." This was all really dire, but I agreed, and he continued on with his preparations for the group. After hearing all of this, I was already feeling a lot of pressure to be a useful observer and research team member, and now I was going to have to be ready to potentially escort crying families out of the room. It was going to be an interesting night, and as I realized that I had 12 envelopes with over $1,000 in cash now sitting in my suit pocket, I wondered how many of them I'd be distributing to mothers and fathers who had endured a successful outcome from the NICU, and how many would be leaving tonight in tears remembering the death of their child. Well, I'll come back to this story in a little bit, but it's a great place for us to start because focus group research has a tendency to be wild and unpredictable in ways that other methods of qualitative or quantitative research are not. There's something about getting together groups of participants that can really turn your session into a powder keg of emotion, and one of the reasons that focus groups are such a popular research method among non-researchers is because they can become very dramatic and engaging simply because of the group dynamics that are present in a room. But before I really get down to talking about all of the limitations and the difficulties of focus groups, let me just offer you a little bit of explanation about what a focus group is. So most people know what a focus group is from having seen one maybe on TV or from maybe having experienced one or even been on one. Focus groups are a very popular method of qualitative research, and they generally involve asking groups of participants to respond to questions and stimuli, and maybe some exercises, projective exercises or written exercises or other types of tools like that. Focus groups are also, however, a flawed method of qualitative research because they come with so many pitfalls and limitations. And when we get to the third part of this lecture series, I'm going to really highlight those. But generally speaking, focus groups come in a few different varieties, and the one that's probably most familiar to you is what we call the traditional focus group. Now, a traditional focus group is conducted in person, often in a research facility with a one-way mirror or a live video feed. They tend to be facilitated by a professional moderator, and I highly recommend that they are. They usually have 6 to 12 participants who are sitting around a table or maybe in a testing area. And, you know, if you've ever seen a focus group on TV, if you've seen it depicted in a show like Mad Men or in a commercial or anything like that, this is what you have probably seen. And the advantages of this style of focus group, these have been around for a long time, and the advantages are that they are easily controlled, they're easily observed, they're generally pretty sterile, by which I mean they take place in a location where the participants are coming in with very little attachment to what's going on. Unlike that scenario I was just talking about where we were in a hospital where people may have had children that died, focus groups generally are taking place in a what appears to be a meeting room with a mirror in it. And as a result, focus groups tend to feel like a meeting. They don't really feel much like anything else. They just feel like a bunch of people getting together and talking about something for a little while. Although unlike a meeting, there's usually not a directly spelled out agenda for the participants, nor is there a need to conduct some kind of business that results in a consensus or voting or anything like that. The drawbacks of traditional focus group, first of all, participants may be uncomfortable. There's a lot of anxiety involved in getting together in a room full of strangers and sharing opinions openly in a way that there are no right or wrong answers. People really aren't used to that, and so it can be very uncomfortable for them. Also, focus groups are in a very unnatural setting. It's very business-like. It's very cold. It often takes folks who are not used to that setting a while to get adjusted and to really feel like they can chime in. And also, traditional focus groups are really limited because of geography. If you want to do a focus group in a city, you're going to have to go with people that are local. If they have to drive more than about 30 to 40 minutes in most metropolitan markets, they just won't show up. In more rural areas, they might drive a little bit further, but local is generally going to be 30 minutes to an hour at most. So because of these drawbacks, there have been some other methods that have come about. One of them is the telephone focus group. Now, telephone focus groups are kind of old news at this point, but they're still being used. They're still around, and telephone focus groups are conducted via a telephone conference, often with a computerized control board that the moderator uses to see who's speaking and to control the audio flow as needed. Sometimes you need to mute people who have really noisy phones, or who have a lot of background noise that's going on, or who just won't be quiet, and you need them to be quiet so that you can move on with the group. So that is a nice advantage of the telephone group, is that the moderator has a little bit more control over the audio flow of the conversation. It's also nice because it's convenient for observers, and observers in this sense, it's kind of a relative term because they're not really observing, they're listening. But with a telephone focus group, people can get on the line and listen. These groups tend to be comfortable because the participants can take them wherever they want. They don't have to be in front of a computer, or they don't have to be in a facility. They can just be on their phone wherever they want to be. They're really easy to conduct nationally. If you want a national sample for telephone focus groups, it's very easy to get. And as a result, they're very good for business-to-business research. Actually, traditional focus groups are terrible for business-to-business research because you tend to get in people that are in the same industry and that might know each other, that might be competitors, and they more often than not want to kind of one-up each other and play games with each other rather than give really useful information. But in a telephone focus group, because you can have a national sample, you can find people that they might be in the same industry, but they don't really know each other. They're not really competitors, and they can share information a little bit more freely without feeling a need to be so competitive. It's very nice. Drawbacks of telephone focus groups, there's no visual data. You don't have any emotional cues that you can read unless you can hear it in people's voices. You can't see how they're thinking or feeling. You can't see how they're squirming. You can't see how they're yawning or anything like that. You only have audio stimuli available to test. So if you wanted to test something visual like an advertisement or a video, you can't do it on the telephone very easily. There are ways, but they don't work very well, like mailing them things ahead of time or having them go to a computer to look at things. They just don't work very well on telephone focus groups. Also, participants may not pay very close attention, and this is in my mind, one of the biggest drawbacks of the method, is that because you can't see the folks that you have in your group, you're assuming that they're paying attention, but you don't know if they're constantly pushing the mute button to drown out background noise. You don't know where they are, what they're doing. They might be in their car driving. They might be on vacation. They might be doing any of the things that they could do in an interview that are perfectly fine, but which in a focus group are really distracting. So another method that has kind of arisen to supplant telephone focus groups have been online video focus groups. So when we talk about online focus groups, there really are two methods, and online video are the more conventional of those two methods. And that is, you get a web conference together where everybody has a webcam that is showing a video signal, kind of like on my lecture video here. You see a little people all over your screen and kind of a Brady Bunch layout. And then most of the time, the providers of these services want them on the telephone for their audio, and that's so that if their video drops, their audio is still available. And the moderator will log into a software platform to manage groups, often with options to conduct exercises or display stimuli. And I just recently went through some of these myself, and I was actually pleasantly surprised at all of the things that I was able to do. With that said, many of the exercises that I designed had been designed for a traditional group where I could just hand people paper, and it actually wasn't as easy to replicate some of those exercises in an online group as it might have been. So online groups, you're really limited by what the platform can do. Also, I found that there were enormous technical difficulties, which I'll mention in a moment. But the good news is that they are very convenient for observers. They can participate in their home, from their home computer usually. They are comfortable, they're easy to conduct nationally, and again, they're good for business to business. The drawbacks is that the technical difficulties are frequent, and we had in the various online groups I've done, we've had people dropping out. We've had people unable to see the stimuli that we've been presenting. We've had people that get into kind of an echo loop where we have to keep muting them because they refuse to turn their computer speakers off and their phone keeps picking up the sound from the group. So as a result, you need to have participants who are somewhat tech savvy. And in the platforms that I've used, both for telephone and online video focus groups, there are technicians that do what's called a tech check with people before the groups and who are present to help them out if need be. But it's very awkward when you're in the middle of a group and you start having technical difficulties and you just have to basically work around it in order to keep the group moving. It makes it a little bit more challenging for everyone in the group. So that's one disadvantage that traditional focus groups don't face. Well, another variation of online focus groups that's arisen has been online message boards. And these are, they're not like a focus group in appearance, but they generate similar kind of data. Basically, what you would do is you create an online community, and you could use a social media platform like Facebook, or you could use something more conventional like a blog or a message board format. And basically, the moderator will go in every day and ask 2 or 3 questions. And then the participants are incented to respond to every one of those questions with a certain minimum threshold of words. And they're also sometimes required to respond to each other. So, if I ask a question and Joseph responds to it, and then Jamie responds to him, her answer can not only reflect what she's thinking, but also what he said. And then Joseph could come back and respond to what Jamie said, or Jane could come in and jump in the fray. So you can really get some nice conversation. You can get a lot more depth and detail out of these online message board comments because the respondents generally have a lot more time to think about what it is they want to say. And you can also prompt them for rich media. You can say, okay, everybody go out today and take a picture of something that really motivates you, and you can use that to have them take a picture of something that's meaningful to them, and then you can come back and ask them to tell you why they took that picture, and you can get some pretty interesting stuff from that. So it kind of has the qualities of a digital diary and kind of has the qualities of a focus group rolled into one. So the advantages are you can get far deeper and more thoughtful discussion, and actually they are easier to quickly analyze than what you get in a regular focus group because you don't have to transcribe or take notes from anything. The data are all there, and you can just start analyzing them. You have a lot more data to analyze, but they're already entered for you. But the drawbacks are participants need to be very tech savvy generally. So this is a technique that works a lot better for younger people. And they also need to be capable of writing well enough to participate. Now, you can do online message board formats where they record videos or things like that, but again, that requires a certain level of technical skill that not everybody has. So if you're going to have them do things in a written form, then they need to be able to write well. And that might not sound like such a big barrier, but it actually is a huge barrier. Just as in a regular focus group, we need people who are articulate and who can speak in a way that we can understand them to be able to participate in a group discussion. In online message boards, they need to be able to write in such a way that we can actually understand what it is they're trying to say. So, a few uses of focus groups. This is not a conclusive, exhaustive list, but this is a list that breaks it down into several categories that are pretty commonly used. One use is idea generation, and I actually think this is the best use of focus groups. I think it's what they're best suited to do. But idea generation is about encouraging a group of participants to come up with new ideas or to help refine existing ideas through brainstorming and qualitative exercises. The group setting encourages people to come up with ideas that as individuals they might not have, and it also helps them to refine those ideas a little bit because they're presenting them to a group of people and discussing them. But the drawback is that the validity and reliability of what you find through idea generation is really hard to measure. You basically have to decide whether or not you think the ideas are any good or not, because you're going to very rarely have 2 groups come up with the same idea unless it's a really general, obvious idea. So for idea generation, focus groups, you really have to interpret your results whether or not they're useful to you, either as a researcher or as a client organization. And that is, in my mind, also a huge limitation, because just hearing ideas come out of a group, it can be really inspiring, it can be really interesting, but you just don't have a way to gauge whether they're good ideas or bad ideas. So you usually have to do further research to really figure out if those ideas are worth their weight or not. Another usage of focus groups is feedback or voice of customer research. This is a pretty common use of focus groups. I would also say that it's an area where there are a lot of landmines and pitfalls that can really limit the usability of the data. But in feedback or voice of customer research, what you're going to do with focus groups is encourage a group of participants to share experiences and provide collective feedback on how those experiences could have been improved. So you might have them walk through an interaction they had. If you have a financial client, how their interaction went at the bank they went to most recently, and how that interaction could have been better, or what it is that they've experienced that's really annoyed them or really made them upset, and what's delighted them, and why that disparity exists, things like that. This is really better suited to individual interviews, I'll be honest with you, but if you're going to use a group setting, the group setting does stimulate sometimes deeper discussion and can improve memory. As you hear about someone else's experience, you can remember your own experience a little bit more deeply. But at the same time, we have to remember memory is really malleable, and we are social creatures, and we're heavily influenced by what other people say. We sometimes have false memories that kind of crop up after hearing someone else's story. So just remember that participants kind of play off each other's experiences, and they might misremember things. They might invent new details that didn't happen. They might find synchronies that didn't really exist. So that's where you have to be careful with the group dynamics that are going on. A third usage is concept testing, and that's encouraging a group of participants to evaluate a new idea, concept, or creative design and provide on-the-spot input on it. Concept testing is another very common use of focus groups, particularly in entertainment and media. And I have really mixed feelings about how it's used. I think it's used pretty badly very often. There's a lot of things like dial testing and things like that are traditional, but when you look at how the methods are applied, they're very shoddy, and they're not what I would describe as being very trustworthy. But anyhow, the nice thing about concept testing, if it's done right, is participants in a group can work together to articulate feelings more clearly. You present them with something that they have a difficult time talking about as individuals, and working together as a group, they can kind of find some ways to talk about it, hopefully have some good discussion and not all feel the same way about things, so that you can get some well-rounded perspectives. And you can get that information pretty efficiently. You don't have to go through hours and hours of testing with multiple respondents. You can get it all in about an hour. The drawback, however, group leaders often influence meeker members' views and opinions. So if you have some really strong voices in the group, and you have some people that don't have as strong of opinions or as much confidence, they can really be influenced by what they perceive to be the group leaders. And that can be very dangerous, because it can give a sense of consensus where there actually isn't any. It's just that people are following the leader. Finally, another general use of focus groups is discussion. And that's just encouraging a group of participants to discuss topics of interest to reveal angles of approach. So, if you're trying to figure out, how can I get more people to use my service or product, you can just give them some different prompts in a focus group and let them talk about it for a little bit. And that might give you some ideas for what you can be doing. It's not quite the same as idea generation, because you're not asking them to generate the ideas. You're just listening for ideas that might be insights to you. This is also a popular tool for evaluating messaging, positioning, or even court arguments. And actually, one of the areas of focus group research that's growing very popular is using focus groups as mock juries to evaluate court arguments. Sometimes it's even being used for jury selection arguments. So focus group research is versatile in that respect. Groups stimulate the evolution of thought and public discourse, or they simulate it, so you can kind of get a sense of, if people were talking about this in public, how would this sound? How would they talk about it? How would the feelings about it evolve? The problem becomes, though, that focus groups are not a microcosm of the public. They are not in any way representative or projectable. What happens in a group cannot be said to necessarily be something that will happen in the wild. So what happens in a focus group can be greatly misleading. And you have to be very careful that you design a really strong, rigorous research design to account for that fact. Otherwise, if you conduct a couple of groups and things seem to be going well, you might draw some conclusions that are not quite as reliable as they might seem to be. Used properly, focus groups can produce effective data fairly efficiently. And by efficiently, I mean, a single focus group takes 60 to 90 minutes. And at the end of that focus group, you have a pretty good amount of information. I usually recommend doing at least 2 focus groups for any subgroup that you're going to study, and we'll talk more about that in a later lecture. But, even in 3 hours, you can get an awful lot of data. Used improperly, however, focus groups can also mislead and produce junk data or false impressions. And this is a very well-known, well-discussed limitation of what focus groups are. A lot of times when you hear about big case studies where businesses really got something wrong is because they were over-relying on focus group research, and maybe they were asking bad questions, or they were trusting the groups to be representative of the public when they really weren't, or they had a moderator who tended to lead people down a certain path. There are all kinds of things that happen, but focus groups are something that should be used to complement other research, not to exclusively be the research that you conduct. So, with that said, those are just some notes on designing and conducting focus groups. In our next lecture, we're going to talk about some more practical tips on actually going through focus groups. So, talk to you then.